There it is. I guess that's showtime. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jessica Sinclair. I'm the director of Panther LabWorks at the Institute for Entrepreneurial Excellence here at the University of Pittsburgh. And I'd like to welcome everyone to our program today, which is New Administration, New Tax Policy. And this is part of our Panther LabWorks Innovation Series program, and it's presented by JPMorgan Chase. We're excited to continue to bring you new informative educational content so you can make the right decisions for yourself and for your small business. And at the Institute for Entrepreneurial Excellence, we strive to bring you the best in class of consulting and educational programming. And we welcome you to visit our website, which is entrepreneur.pitt.edu, to check out the types of programming that we have available, and also to sign up for consulting or to see the types of programs that we have for all different types of entrepreneurs and small businesses. So I'm going to actually turn it over right now to Cindy Costa. She's the Vice President for Business Development Manager at Chase. So Cindy, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and good morning to everybody. Thanks for having us. I'm a business development manager for Chase, and my team work with the small businesses in Pittsburgh. And so this webinar was created, and I want to commend IEE for getting the survey out to its members on what you want your sponsors to come to these webinars with, and the resources and knowledge that you want and don't want. So I encourage you to continue to let us know as your sponsor. We at JPMorgan Chase are always happy to share our knowledge. And so I have the honor of introducing two amazing professionals at Chase, Elizabeth Herman and Rich Schwartz. Liz is the U.S. Federal Government Relations. She sits in D.C., specializes in tax and retirement policy, and is a lawyer by trade. And with her, we have Rich Schwartz, who is our private bank and wealth management and advisor. He works with and focuses on representing representing owners of closely held businesses, specializing in tax and retirement policies, strategies for regarding estate and gift taxes, business succession planning, philanthropy, and wealth preservation. So thank you both for being here. I am going to ask Chris Burton, our very own here in Pittsburgh and Private Bank, to kick us off and give us the lay of the land for this hour. Chris?
Great. Thanks, Cindy. And thanks, everyone, for joining. Again, we very much appreciate the partnership we have with the Institute. So we're excited to bring our speakers here. And one of the things that at JPMorgan Chase that we're able to do is provide thought leadership to the marketplace. And we're happy to do that. And we found so many of these topics are coming up in every single meeting we're having. So as we look forward, really what we're going to have to do is I'll turn it over to Liz. She'll break down from a high level overview of what we've seen proposed, what we think will actually happen, when might it happen, and interestingly, how might we pay for this? And then Rich will take it down to the level of what would you as a business owner do to best position yourself for the upcoming changes. So, again, with that, I'll turn it over to Liz, and I encourage everybody, please take advantage of the question and answer feature. We'll be monitoring that, and as time permits, we'll certainly pass along any questions that you might have along the way. So we are monitoring that, so please take advantage. And with that, I'll turn it over to Liz.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Exciting week in Washington as the Senate finished voting on their budget bill at about 4 a.m. and then left for their states. They're all getting on flights right now to go home to their states until mid-September. So we are now hitting August recess when essentially nothing will happen in Washington until mid-September when everyone comes back. But what the question I guess everybody has is when do they actually start working on things like tax policy? It's a really interesting time in Washington because of the fact that there's really only so much time left on the calendar when we know that Pelosi, Schumer, and Biden are all leading their relevant parts of the government and therefore can get things done with only Democratic votes. Midterms are coming. 2022 is not that far away. There's a lot of news this week about the census and how that's going to be really bad for gerrymandering if you're a Democrat and you want to keep the House with the Democratic Party and not with the Republican Party. So people have this on their radar. The Democrats only have a certain amount of time to get things done before they may lose the House and or Senate. And that's why they're looking at tax policy, because that can't happen if there's Republican control in one chamber. And we're watching to see what's happening on Capitol Hill. So really what we're focused on is when they'll get around to that. And really we think that is the kind of the final thing they will deal with. When they come back from summer, what we think they're going to start working on is this budget reconciliation package, this news about Democratic priorities, $3.5 trillion in priorities. And taxes are part of that. It's how you're going to pay for that. And that's why we think they'll be looking at tax late in the conversation. Once they know what they actually want to do, whether it's climate or immigration or doing more infrastructure or education policy, that'll give them a sense of how much money they want to raise. And a lot of that is going to look like this $1 trillion number. And the only way you get $1 trillion in Washington is really by raising taxes. And that's why we think they'll be looking to the tax code, particularly the corporate rate, but also things like the individual rate and capital gains, to start focusing on looking at those things to raise taxes and raise that money to pay for this next chapter of Biden's infrastructure plan. So I think, and more to like just reset where things are in terms of risks. These are all things they're focused on. This $1 trillion number is this number that is in the reconciliation package. It is sort of a moonshot number. There's no guarantee that $1 trillion is what they have to raise. It is really this balancing game we're going to see going into the fall. So I think that's the big question out there is like, how much money do they need and where will they get it from? You can raise about $100 billion every time you raise the corporate interest rate. So it's 100 billion every single point. We know they're looking at things like 21 to 25%, not the Biden 28%. That's a big target, but they're sort of going to make up ground from that also. So I think some of that is the fact they'll be looking at the corporate rate, the individual rate, particularly on high earners above the $400,000 mark, and also carried interest. Those are all issues that are hard. They're politically very challenging for these members. No one wants to raise taxes unless you're in a really progressive district where that's a winning message for you. You see that in the news a lot. You see the Warren, Sanders, AOC type members talking about raising taxes. They are not representative of most of Congress. Most of these guys have middle of the road districts with voters who care about things like schools and the economy. They're not focused on raising taxes. So if these guys are going to take a vote to raise taxes, they have to be very confident that this is something that is not going to lose them their seat come November. So it's a very sensitive issue, and that's why this is going to drag on really for a while for them to get to that point.
So Liz, one of the questions we get quite frequently in client meetings are, would any of these tax changes potentially be retroactive to the beginning of the year? You know, especially business owners looking to position for a business sale. What are the thoughts on the timing and the retroactivity of any of these tax issues?
That's a great question. I think retroactive is really hard for these members. In 2017, it sort of surprised everyone that they did retroactive tax decreases rather. They did the 2017 TCJA retroactive. That was an end of year surprise. I was on Capitol Hill at the time, working for one of those committee members. Everyone was a little thrown by that, but it was considered a tax cut for a lot of Americans. So it was a political win. In this case, they're looking at a tax increase on high income Americans, on capital gains, on businesses. To do that retroactively, especially when we're in the middle of a COVID recovery, and we know not every industry has recovered, would be politically toxic. It's a really hard decision. We see that conversation more around capital gains because there is concern about people doing a massive sell-off and really doing a lot of planning around that. It is a conversation they're having, but we really do think the effective date for things would be January 1. It would mean it's a pretty narrow window between things passing at the end of the year, if they do pass, and things going into effect, but we don't think retroactive is what they'll go for.
So when we look at, you know, the blueprint that was passed just this morning, I believe, which again is a much larger number, where do we kind of fall out in terms of thinking what of that is just merely a wish list, or what of it is actually going to get done? Because, you know, as I looked at the Wall Street Journal this morning, you're talking about 3.5 trillion blueprint that was approved, and what do they mean, and what will actually come of that?
The 3.5 is this goal number, 3.5 trillion. On one hand, you have progressives who are really mad that it's not 5 trillion, $6 trillion. They want it even bigger. And then you have moderates who are kind of questioning whether they're doing anything at all, whether they even need another package, and if they should be looking at 1 trillion or 2 trillion. So 3.5 is almost this goal somewhere in the middle. They are not tied to that number. These budget reconciliation instructions that talk about the 3.5 tell Congress, when you come back in the fall, you should come up with this reconciliation bill that can pass with 51 votes. to raise $3.5 trillion, to do $3.5 trillion in policy spending and raising money. It's a guidepost for Congress. They do not have to stick to it, and they will have trouble sticking to it because they do need to have unanimous support in the Democratic Party. And we have Joe Manchin, we have Kristen Sinema, and other moderates already very publicly saying, I will not support 3.5 trillion. So it's this really hard, delicate dance for Pelosi and Schumer if they have members who are saying 3.5 is too small, but also plenty of members saying it's just a hard no for them for 3.5.
So when we look, and Rich, maybe this is where you could jump in as well, but one of the questions we frequently get with our clients in our planning meetings is around the state exemptions. Where do we think that will fall out? And, you know, we've been essentially saying we don't think that number's ever going to go up, but what will it come down to? And as people work on their estate plans, what are some of the things they should do in advance or in anticipation of changes to that exemption level?
Sure, I'll jump in there. And the first thing I'll say is, if you told me back in November of last year that Biden would win and we'd have a Democratic Congress and there would be nothing in any of the proposals about the estate tax exemption, I would have said you were crazy. I would have said there's absolutely no way. So I think, you know, first, let me just back up and make sure everyone is aware of the estate tax and what it is and how it works. And so we can talk about that from a perspective of what could happen. So that everyone is aware, there is an estate tax. What does that mean? When you pass away, you have to value every single asset you own. That's cash, marketable securities, your business, life insurance, retirement plans, real estate. Everything you have has to be valued. And what happens is the first certain amount, what many people refer to as an exemption, it's technically not called an exemption, but everyone refers to it as an exemption, that amount passes free of tax. That amount today is $11.7 million. So that's a fairly high number. Many people are not subject to this tax. So you have a tax that says if you're a married couple, you could pass $23.4 million to your kids with no tax. Now the tax rate is 40%. So if you exceed $23.4 million as a married couple, anything above that excess is subject to tax at a 40% rate. Now, this law only came into effect in 2017 when, you know, the TJSCA was passed. And so what happens is, in order for them to pay for it back then, they said, okay, well, we have to go back to what the law was previously in 2026. So that means in 2026, this exemption amount is only going to be $5 million. And this is absent any change in the meantime, but this is $5 million. So that means, and it's indexed for inflation, so it'll probably be $6 million, but let's just assume it's the 5 million. That means if you pass away today as a married couple, you can pass $23.4 million to your kids tax-free. If you selfishly wait until 2026 to die, and you die then what happens is you could only pass $10 million to your kids tax-free. So you've just costed your kids roughly $5.5 million in tax by waiting until 2026 to die. Now, obviously, planning to die is not the best planning idea for you. And so the question is, well, what do you do about that? And before we get to what do you do about that, well, what are the potential for changes? Again, as I said, you know, I was having conversations with clients that said last year, well, if Biden wins and we have a Democratic Congress, that $5 million exemption is going to come out it's going to happen much sooner, or maybe it even comes lower than that. And then Biden came out and he has not talked about the estate tax exemption at one time this year. You know, I think his proposal, and Liz, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was to restore it to historic norms. And if anyone on this call can tell me what historic norms are, that would be great, considering in 1999, the exemption was 675,000. Then it went to 2 million or 1 million. Then it was 1.5 million, then 2 million, then 3.5 million. Then there was no tax at all in 2010. So George Steinbrenner was kind enough to pass away and leave the Yankees to his kids for no tax at that time. But then it went to $5 million and then it's 11.7. So whatever historic norms are, we don't know. Again, as Liz mentioned, there there is a lot of talk about income taxes being changed and capital gains rate, and that nothing has been discussed about the estate tax. That being said, 95% of my conversations deal with planning around the estate tax. Because as I said, we don't want to worry about, having to die before the law changes. We want to do some planning. And what can you do? So the first thing a lot of people say is, well, I'll just give away all my assets before I die, so I don't have to worry about it. Well, there's a gift tax. The gift tax basically says if you transfer assets during your lifetime, it's subject to the gift tax. Now, under today's law, that exemption amount, you get an exemption for gift tax, is the same as the estate tax amount. So that's $11.7 million. So if I make a gift to my kids of $11.7 million, there's zero tax on that from a gift tax perspective. But the way the law works is it's a unified exemption with the estate tax. So if I were to use up all of my $11.7 million during my lifetime, I now have none of it at my death. So because if I made that $11.7 million gift to my kids and then I died, anything I had left in my hands would be subject to tax at that time, that 40% rate under current law. But then the question is, okay, well, if you make a gift today of 11.7 and there's no tax on it, and then the law changes to $5 million, what happens? Is there some type of clawback? Now, I will say this happened once before in 2012, where there was discussions of the rates changing and everyone was concerned about clawback. Well, this time around, they put a provision in the law that kind of said, yeah, there's not going to be clawback. Whether that is actually going to be the case, I don't know. But basically what that means is if you use your exemption today and you transfer 11.7 million to your kids, or a trust for your kids, or a trust for your spouse and your kids, there's no gift tax associated with it. If the law changes, you've won. Because what happens is that amount is now outside of your estate and will never be subject to the estate and gift tax. So what we have right now are a lot of people rushing to say, okay, if this law changes in 5 years or sooner, if maybe as part of this, proposal, they do some negotiating and they say, oh, well, it's much easier to tax people that are worth $5 million than, the 400,000 of income from any policies. Maybe we're going to change this estate tax exemption. So you rush out and do it today. If you transfer 11.7 million to a trust for your kids, it's outside of it and you've taken advantage of the law today. Now, I will tell you, this is something where we have a lot of clients say, oh, that sounds great, let me do that. Well, in order for it to get out of your estate, meaning it's not subject to tax at your death, you have to give up access to that money yourself. Now, I don't care how much you're worth. That's a tough conversation to have when you say, I'm willing to transfer 11.7 million to someone other than me. Now, a lot of people build their spouse in. And so, well, technically there's no taxes between spouses. So if my spouse is a beneficiary and I put a trust in place, 11.7, my spouse can get a distribution and I can get it back. That's great. But if you get divorced or if your spouse dies, you lose access to it. So a lot of the conversations I have with clients are thinking about, do you need that money? Because if you do, then maybe it's not the best idea to put this money into a trust. Now, one thing I'll note on that, and this is the question that a lot of people come with, is they say, okay, so I'm not really comfortable giving up access to $11.7 million. But if this law changes and it goes from 11.7 to 5, well, can I just use the 6? Because I'm comfortable giving up access to 6. Unfortunately, that's not the way the law works. The law works because you give up the bottom up, not top down. So I'll give you a quick example. I make a $6 million gift to my kids today. No gift tax associated with that. I have now used 6 million of my exemption. I have, under current law, 5.7 of my exemption left. If in 5 years that law changes to a $5 million exemption, the way the law works is I will have 0 exemption left because it's treated as using it from the bottom up, not the top down. So I really only got the benefit of that extra 1 million. I made a gift of 6 and it went to 5. I've only done that. So the only way to really take advantage of the full $11.7 million exemption is to use the full $11.7 million exemption. So I want everyone to be aware of that when we're talking about, because that's what all these conversations are about. Is the law going to change? And if it does, what are the things we can do to take advantage of the law? That's the major thing. So, I'll pause there because I could talk about a lot more as it relates to this, but I'll see if there's if we want to transition to another thing as it relates to these taxes.
Yeah, that was great, Rich. And I think, as a Yankees fan, I appreciate the example you gave, and maybe you threw that in as a bone for me. I'm not sure. But Liz, as we talk about doing all these planning techniques for our clients and our prospects, and what are the thoughts in terms of the midterms coming up? Should we rush to make a lot of changes based on the fact, what are the tea leaves, if you will, in terms of the elections next year? Because a lot of this, even if it does change, could change back. And that's maybe a question more than a statement. What are the thoughts about doing too much planning, recognizing that typically midterms favor the office not in the White House, or the party not in the White House?
That's a good question. I mean, that is always true of Washington. Even when something is permanent in law, it could still always be changed. But I think with the midterms coming up, what those tell us is that there's a rush to get things done because of the fact that, as I mentioned, we have Pelosi, Schumer, and Biden, who are just not sure if they will be all the parties in power come 2023. The White House, of course, will remain, but Schumer and Pelosi could end up as minority leaders. So there will be this rush this year for them to try to get something done. And the reason I say this year and not next year is because in an election year, primaries start dominating the conversation in Washington among both parties. So come next year, once we get about 4 months into the year, people will start watching the midterms and less will get done in Washington. So if they're looking at the tax code, they are looking at it now. They are looking at it in 2021's calendar year. And that's the rush to do everything. So that's why I think all this planning is so key, because if there's a change, it's going to happen soon. It will probably be effective next year. Things can always change in the future, but of course, if Republicans did take power and wanted to reverse things, they still have Biden in the White House, who would really be standing there to say, I'm not letting you undo things that we did in my administration. So there is some confidence that whatever changes happen from Congress now, they could be tweaked with some Treasury regulations, but we wouldn't expect the Biden White House to be reversing anything while they're still in their first term.
Liz, I'm going to jump in and ask you a few questions and put you on the spot here. So a couple of the income tax provisions that have been discussed, for instance, doubling the capital gains tax rate, which, that was in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and highlights of, oh God, this is going to happen, and everyone's freaking out. I know what your thoughts are, but for everyone else, what do you think the chances of doubling the capital gains tax rate would be at this point?
I think that Wall Street Journal article that you mentioned was a great example of why this is so hard. When members talk about the capital gains increase, they're always talking about super wealthy individuals and how this is such a great political issue for them. The Wall Street Journal article talked about somebody who really doesn't make a lot of money, but he owns a lot of assets. And before retirement, he wants to sell them all. And should that man be punished with a double the capital gains rate because one time in his life he made a big sale? And I think that's the political issue there, is members don't want to take that vote and hurt that person. It's really hard to do this kind of change in law without just hitting everyone. Members see this as a tough issue. We don't think that the Biden proposal, which was about changing the capital gains rate to 40%, we don't think that's a realistic number. We think members get that double rate is just impossible. If they're going to do something here, if capital gains remains a target, and it is, they would land at something a couple points higher, maybe mid-20s. So there would be a difference, but it would not be as severe as what Biden is talking about, but members would be looking for a way to scale it back.
Yeah, and I know there are a lot of business owners on this call, and I have conversations with people all the time where they say, well, what should I do? Should I sell my business now? My answer is always no. What you should do is, if you're considering selling your business in the near future, next year, maybe the year after, if you are, and you're trying to do that, then do it this year. Do it this year, because while I don't think it's going to be, as Liz said, it's not going to be double. It may be a few points. A few points is still money. and it's still going to save you something. So if you have that option, I had another client who said, okay, I'm selling my business in first quarter of 2022. I just said, hey, just in case, while I don't think we're going to get the double, just in case, why don't you try and get that done in Q4 of this year to try and avoid it. But again, I just want everyone to be aware, this is not something where you should rush out, because as I think Chris was saying, midterms can change a lot of things, and who knows what happens in the future. But if this is something that's on the near-term horizon for you, if you're selling any asset, whether it's your stock in some publicly traded company, or if you're selling your business and you're like, I'm definitely selling, I just don't know when, you may want to push that into this year to try and get it under these current rates.
No, that's great. And Rich, in terms of other techniques, to take advantage of the exemption rate, and I know you said that's not the right word, but that's the only one I know, going down to, at some point, are there techniques of getting things out of the estate in what I'll call a creative way, such that, we're giving it away, but we're not really giving it away? Or, just some ideas, because I know that so many of the conversations we have with our clients revolve around things like that. And without getting too dark into the weeds, maybe just some solution strategies that, the business owners on this can reach out to their advisors to say, hey, I heard about a neat concept on a call.
Yeah, so estate planning is all about doing something sooner rather than later. Obviously, the first part of that is the potential change in the law. So as I mentioned, if it changes, you want to do something sooner rather than later. But you may not be comfortable giving up access to $11.7 million. So you say, well, are there other things I can do? And that's the second aspect of estate planning, and why you do it sooner, especially with regard to business owners, is leveraging your value of your business. So give you a quick example. Someone comes out and you value your business, you get an appraisal and it says it's worth $10 million. If I wanted to give away that business at $10 million, I give it to my kids, and anytime I say give it to the kids, I mean trust for the kids. So that's just, be aware that that's a given. You don't want to give your kids that money, divorce protection, creditors, they're going to blow it, whatever, but put it into trust for them. But I do that. I now have used 10 million of my exemption and I've shifted that business to them. Okay. No tax on that, right? Because I use my gift tax exemption. But now, 3 years from now, that business is sold, and that business is sold for $15 million. What happens? Nothing. My kids now got a $15 million business, and it only cost 10 million of my exemption to get it out of my estate. So that's a win, because if I didn't give it to them now and I waited until I sold the business, I would have $15 million. In order to get that same 15 million, I would need 15 million of exemption. So leveraging your exemption sooner rather than later makes a lot of sense. Now, as it relates to business owners, there's also something called discounting the value. Now, when you have a privately held business and you are giving away a minority interest in that business, you can discount that value for lack of control, lack of marketability. So when I say, okay, I have a $10 million business and I want to give away 25% of it to my kids, because most people don't want to give away 100% of their business anyway, while they still are living. So they want to give away 25%. Now, you would look at it from a sale perspective. If you sold it for 10 million, 25% is worth 2.5 million. But from a gift perspective, it's not worth 2.5 million, because who's going to buy a 25% interest in this minority, in this closely held business? No one. They're not going to pay you $2.5 million for it, because they don't have control, they don't have a vote, and they can't just readily sell it. So you can get a discount to that value. Some discounts you see 30%, 35%, they're all over the map. You have to get an appraiser to do it. But let's say it's 35%. And I probably should have picked something else, because now I have to figure out what 35% of $2.5 million is, but something less than $2 million. So now it's worth something less than $2 million. So now you transfer that interest to a trust for your kids. You've used less exemption to get it over there because of those discounts. And now if it's sold, you now got more to your kids. Okay. That was a long-winded way of not answering Chris's question. And so that uses your exemption. There are other techniques that you can do that freeze that value in your hands. And it's all about leveraging the exemption and freezing the value. Because we have clients who say, my business is worth 10 million. I want to shift 10 million to my kids. That's great. But then we have a lot of people who say, I want that 10 million. Yeah, if we sell the business for 15, I'm happy with my kids getting the appreciation, but I want the 10 myself. And so what you do is there's these freeze techniques. And again, it has the same thing to do with the leveraging the value and taking discounts, but let's just make it easy and you have a $10 million business interest. You shift that to one of these techniques. It's called a GRAT, or a Grantor Retained Annuity Trust. I'm mentioning it. It's an acronym. I hate using acronyms, but this is one that everyone knows about. It's actually in the tax code. It sits there. It's called Grantor Retained Annuity Trust in the tax code. It's a GRAT. This technique says, I take my business. It is worth $10 million. I put it into a trust for my family, not for me, my family. The trust says, over the next period of years, let's say 2, I have to get back $10 million plus a small interest rate. And this is the interest rate that's set by the IRS. It's actually called the 75/20 rate, but it's based on the applicable federal rate that the IRS sets every month. And so right now it's 1.2%. So I put $10 million business interest into this GRAT. This GRAT says over the next 2 years, I have to get back $10 million plus 1.2% in interest. Now, because I am getting back what I put in, I am not making a gift. There's no gift. So I didn't have to use any of my exemption. And from my perspective, I'm in no worse off place than if my business is just valued at $10 million. I put in 10 million, I get back 10 million. Great. But let's say your goal is to sell that business in the next 2 years, and your goal is to sell it for $15 million. What happened? You have put in $10 million of stock. You get back $10 million plus that 1.2%, but the stock is sold in the meantime for $15 million. You have frozen the value in your estate. So what does that mean? You got back your 10 million. You could spend it however you want. It's yours. But that 5 million in appreciation is now with your family, whether it's your spouse, your kids, it's there and it's outside of your estate. You have not used any of your gift tax exemption to do that. So what happens is a lot of clients say, yeah, I'm comfortable with my balance sheet the way it is today. I like that. I don't want to give up the $11.7 million. Maybe if the law changes, so be it. The law changes, but I'm not comfortable to give it up. But I am comfortable giving up the upside. So you're freezing the value. That type of technique is what we have clients with businesses do all the time. There's another, before you jump in, Chris, I'll just say there is another technique that's very similar, and it's basically selling it to a trust for a promissory note. You could structure that a little longer than a GRAT for a various number of reasons. That one is more generational planning. There's some pros to it. The downside is it's not specifically authorized by the tax code, so there's more of a risk of IRS challenge. But these are freeze techniques that we have a lot of clients doing. Now, it doesn't really have to do with the change in the law as much as doing planning sooner rather than later.
Yeah, that's great. And we did get a couple questions, so I just wanted to throw them out. And Rich, they're more planning specific. So the first one asks about, the way I read it is, what asset level in general does it make sense to even talk about starting trust structures, period? And then the second one's an interesting one that we're dealing with a prospect as we speak. Given the anticipated increase in income tax rates, should we take a special look at converting a traditional IRA to a Roth IRA in order to maximize what would go to the kids or the ultimate beneficiary, assuming it's the kids? So does it make sense in anticipation of even incremental income tax hits going up to look at that? So those are just a couple of questions rolling in. And again, I encourage people to keep them coming, and we'll bring them in as we can.
Yeah, I can answer both of those because I have those conversations a lot. The first one with regard to how much is the right amount for a trust, there is no right amount. As you look at it, when you create a trust, and the one thing you have to get over with the mindset is I am creating trust fund kids, because that's what everyone thinks of when they think of a trust. It's like, oh, it's just the really wealthy people that have trust. No, obviously there are tax reasons for creating a trust. But there's also a lot of non-tax reasons for creating a trust, primarily creditor protection. So when we have clients who create trusts, they're doing it for not just the tax benefit, but they're doing it because one of two reasons. One, they think, hey, my kids can't handle this amount of money. And that could be any amount of money. I'll talk about the annual exclusion from gift tax in a second, but it could be any amount of money. And you put that money in, you're like, I don't think my kids can handle it, but I want to leave them some money that they can have access to without giving them the control to go out and just buy whatever they want. So putting that money into a trust makes a lot of sense, but it's also protecting them from creditors. And creditors come in many shapes and sizes. Most people, the biggest creditor that they know about is a divorcing spouse. Depending on the state you live in, your trust that you create could be protected from a divorcing spouse. And so a lot of people do that with any amount of money they leave to their kids. It doesn't matter what the amount is. But again, you could have a bad business deal. You could be underinsured in a car accident, anything like that. Those assets can be protected by the trust structure. But back to the amount for a second. There is an exception I didn't talk about yet from the gift tax rules. So there's a couple exceptions that you just need to be aware of. First one is spouse. I said that earlier. You leave anything to your spouse, there's no tax. You can leave $100 million to your spouse, no tax. Same thing with charity. Anything you leave to charity, there's no tax. Two other exceptions you have. One is the annual exclusion from gift tax. I could write a $15,000 check to as many people as I want every single year. Because I am married, my wife and I can give $30,000 to as many people as we want every year. That's called the annual exclusion. We have a lot of clients that say, I want to take advantage of this annual exclusion amount of giving $30,000 to my grandkids, for instance. But I don't want to give my grandkids $30,000 that they can just use however they want. Putting that into a trust can put some guardrails on the amount you're giving to them. And you're putting it in hand. So I've seen clients who do a trust for just the annual exclusion, $30,000 a year. That can make a lot of sense. So the amount isn't really important. It's the rationale behind why you would want to do it. The other question, before I get to that, I know I just mentioned there was another exception. It's paying tuition and medical expenses for someone. That's not considered a gift. So if you pay that tuition directly to the institution, we have if you look at private schools, most of the tuition is paid by grandparents. It's because they get that bill, they pay it directly to the school. That's not even considered a gift. It doesn't use your exemption. It doesn't use your annual exclusion. So that's something that's free gift, I like to say, for the education, medical expenses as well. The second one, the Roth IRA. This is coming up a lot now. And it's one of the things that we have a lot of clients consider. What is it? Right now, you have a traditional IRA, traditional 401k. What happens? You turn 72, for the most part. You turn 72, you have to start taking distributions out of it. So it's been growing tax deferred for however many years you've been contributing to it. At age 72, you have to take money out. And when you take that money out, you have to pay income tax on it at whatever the rates are at that time. What's a Roth IRA? A Roth IRA, or a Roth conversion in this case, is taking your traditional IRA, paying all of the tax on it today. Now it grows not tax deferred, but tax free. So that money grows. You don't have to take it out during your lifetime. You could let it sit there. But if you do take it out, let's say at age 72, there's no tax on it. You've already paid the tax on it. So we have a lot of clients who say, oh, well, if the rates are lower today than what they will be like in the future, then I should absolutely do that now. I will caution you against that. Not that it's a bad idea, but I will say there are a lot of variables in place here. The first thing is just conceptually, I hate paying tax when you don't have to. And a lot of clients don't like paying tax sooner than they need to. Just as an aside, it makes sense to pay gift tax rather than estate tax. However, you're alive when you pay the gift tax, and that decreases your balance sheet. When you pay the estate tax, you're already gone, so you don't really care as much. However, from a monetary standpoint, it makes sense to pay the gift tax. Okay, that being said, when you convert that Roth IRA, why does it make sense? It makes sense in a couple of situations. One, You have to have assets outside of the IRA to pay that tax bill. Because if you're taking money out of the IRA to pay the tax, you're defeating the effectiveness of this technique, because now there's less money to grow tax-free. The other thing, so there's 4 variables. That's one. 2 of these variables you can control. Do you have assets outside to pay the tax? The other one is, do you have a charitable component to your estate plan? If you have a charitable component to your estate plan and you leave your retirement plan assets to the charity, there is no income tax on it. Nobody pays income tax on it. So if you convert to a Roth and then end up leaving your retirement plan to a charity, you've paid that tax unnecessarily. So if you have those 2 things, you say no charity and I have the cash, it may make sense to do it. But here are the 2 other variables. And these, unfortunately, you can't control. One is, what are the tax rates going to be like in the future? When you do a Roth conversion, you take your traditional IRA, you're going to pay tax on all of it today at today's rates. So if the top rate, you take $1 million IRA and you put $1 million into your income, you're in the top bracket, you pay tax at 37%. Okay, that's a check you're going to have to write next April. If instead, and now you'll never have tax again on that because now it's a Roth IRA. But if instead you say, okay, I'm going to wait until I'm 72. I'm going to start taking it out. And you don't have to take it out in a lump sum. You get to take it out in chunks. And maybe you're not in the top bracket. So maybe you're in a lower bracket. And that may make sense. But what if the tax rates go up? And the tax rates go up and you say, okay, now I have to pay tax in the future at a higher amount. Well, then it may make sense to do it now rather than later, because the tax rates could go up and you could be paying more. You also have to take into account where you're going to live. Some states, Pennsylvania, for instance, doesn't tax distributions from an IRA. Florida has no income tax at all. If you're living in, a state that has a really high income tax rate, that if you convert today, but you plan on moving in retirement to a no tax state, well, then maybe converting today doesn't make as much sense. And then the last variable that you cannot control is, when are you going to die? Because if you convert and pay the tax today and then die tomorrow, that was a really bad decision because you didn't have time to make up for all of that money coming out of, or to recover all that taxes you paid. So what we do a lot is we sit down and look at the numbers and throw in the different variables. What happens if tax rates go up? What if they go down? What if you live 20 years? What if you live 10 years? How does that play into it to see if it makes a lot of sense? Now, that being said, there are a lot of people it does make sense for, where you look at it and you want to consider that, especially if tax rates are going up. But that's something to just consider. Again, it's just one factor, but we have a lot of clients who are considering that now.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that. And so hopefully, we've been able to provide some good info, and I see we're slowly getting towards the top of the hour, but the mindset we've always talked about is, taking these high level changes and applying them to individual situations. Liz, as we look across the political landscape, no one's going to hold, well, maybe Rich will hold you to it, but what's your best guess? What's really going to happen here in terms of what changes are we going to see? And again, so much of this is bluffing, posturing, whatever we want to call it. But in your experience, what do you think we're going to be looking at in 2022 in terms of a new tax landscape for business owners?
I think there is still a 50-50 chance this all falls apart and the law is status quo. So that is truly the landscape. And a lot of that reflects the fact that they just passed the bipartisan infrastructure package in the Senate last night, and we expect that to pass the House, which gives Biden a win and a lot of Democrats something to point to say we did something and we don't need to do anything else. There is still that 50% chance, though, that they will do something more, and it would not be 3.5 trillion. It would be a far slimmed down version of something in the $1 trillion range of a second infrastructure-esque type package with tax increases in there. And so we do think there is that 50% chance that that smaller package passes and that they do target those things, like increasing rates to 39.6 for people who earn over 400,000, raising the corporate rate a few points, and even possibly having that capital gains increase a little bit. And always that threat of touching the estate tax. That's something that we've seen hasn't gotten a lot of conversation, but it's easy to throw in there at the end if they're looking for a couple extra dollars to help pay for something. It raises money, and sometimes that's all that's necessary in Washington to find a way to offset the thing you're trying to pay for. And the estate tax is one of those things.
Yeah, it's interesting. And as I said before, that's one of those things that is an easy change to the law by just changing the amount of the exemption. It's a lot different than one of the other provisions where, you know, it's getting rid of the step up in basis or triggering capital gains tax at death. That's a wholesale change, not just politically, but just from a tax administration perspective. That's a wholesale change that you would have to make. And so, you know, to Liz's point, an easy fix is changing the exemption and that estate tax.
Exactly. And I just would follow up to say some of this, because they are looking at this hard deadline of having to get stuff done this year, the things that are really complicated, like when you see the White House talking about changing international tax law as applies to corporations, that's incredibly complicated. It's a multinational corporate, you know, negotiation. Doing things like changing the rates or changing a threshold, that's like a cut and paste thing in the tax code. It's easy to do and you can do it at the last minute.
Yeah, that's great. And, Rich, we have another question that came in here, and this might be something that there's a lot of situations we need to find out some more, but what advice do you have for the passing of ownership from father to kids in a privately held S Corp where the family owns about 2/3 of the business?
Yeah, so S corporations are interesting for planning. The first thing I'll say with regard to an S corporation is all the techniques I talked about before, whether you just put it into a trust, and I'm going to say with a caveat, but you put it into a trust using your exemption, using that GRAT, sale for a promissory note, they work really well with S corporation stock. Because there's not that second layer of tax that you have with a C corporation, you can pay for some of these things by making distributions from the company without a second layer of tax. However, that caveat that I want to mention is S corporations can only have certain members or certain owners, okay? Specifically as it relates to trusts. So there are rules that basically say you can't have a trust that owns an S corporation, with 3 exceptions. One, and this is well beyond this call, but I will just run through them quickly. One is what's called a grantor trust. That's a trust where you create a trust and you are responsible for that. So I take this trust, my S corporation stock, I put it into a trust for my kids. I am still responsible for all the income tax associated with it. Now, from a lifestyle perspective, that looks like a bad idea because now all of the income flows through to the trust, but I have to pay the tax on it. From an estate tax perspective, that's great. I'm able to shift more wealth to my kids because I'm paying the tax for them. Okay, so I'm reducing my estate and I'm getting it there. A grantor trust is allowed to hold S corporation stock. So that's one. There are 2 other types of trusts. Both of them require you filing something with the IRS. One is called a QIST, Qualified Subchapter S trust, where you put it into trust for your kids. They have to get all of the income. They could be the only beneficiaries, but you could structure it again. You have to file something with the IRS. The other one is called an SBIT, Electing Small Business Trust, where basically you have to pay tax at the top rate, regardless of what the income is on the trust, but you could have multiple beneficiaries and do all this. Again, you have to file an election. So all of the planning techniques I talked about earlier can be done. So putting it into a trust for your kids, doing a GRAT, doing a sale for a promissory note, all those things work and they work really well with S corporations. You just have to make sure the trust is structured in one of those 3 ways.
Great. And Liz, we had a question I think probably runs your way. Talking about, it says trade taxes. I'm assuming perhaps they mean tariffs. Considering imports for raw materials related to the infrastructure passage, we're going to be building a lot of things, and we don't manufacture everything here in the U.S. So is that part of the thought process in terms of potential tariffs on imports of things needed to build out the roads, bridges, et cetera?
Currently, that's not part of the conversation. What is part of the conversations on tariffs is the fact that we still have a lot of tariffs in place that date to the Trump era. And the Biden administration just hasn't removed those, whether we're talking about like steel and aluminum or a lot of other things that are traded with China. It sort of surprised everyone that the Biden administration didn't come in and undo that all immediately. the business community has been working very hard with the administration, with the Department of Commerce, USTR, and all the officials to say, hey, like prices are going up, the economy is recovering. It would be great if you could remove a lot of these tariffs in place to make things easier. And they're in listening mode on that. We haven't seen changes yet. We're curious to see when things will start shifting, but there's definite interest on that issue here in Washington.
Yeah, that's great. So as we're moving towards the top of the hour here, and in the absence of any questions, Rich or Liz, if you have any last thoughts, that's great. And if not, we'd certainly just like to thank everyone who was able to join this call today. We know that there's Zoom fatigue and webinar fatigue, and we look forward to doing these kind of events in person. In conjunction with Pitt and the Institute for Entrepreneurial Excellence. So we're very excited and we're very passionate about what we do, and we love advising our clients. To the extent that people have individual questions, you can certainly feel free to reach out to us, through Pitt if you can't find our contacts. But again, a lot of the LinkedIn information around this was out there. We're happy to be a sounding board. And again, hopefully you've taken away at a minimum the level of expertise we have within our institution, both from the political landscape to the planning landscape. And as you can see, we're passionate and knowledgeable about what we do. And at the end of the day, we really love advising our clients, whether they're on the personal side of the balance sheet, which is the private bank, or Cindy's group in the business bank. So, I could turn over to Rich and to Liz for last minute thoughts, and then we'll just say goodbye and get everyone out to lunch.
Yeah, so there's just a couple things, because the question I get most often is, I'm selling my business and how do I minimize taxes, income taxes? The unfortunate thing is there's not a lot you can really do. There are some crazy techniques that maybe if you thought of this years ago, you could do it. But from a short-term perspective, you're selling a business, because again, most of your business owners, you're selling a business. What are some things you can do? First one, easiest one, do some charitable planning. Charitable planning is the best thing to minimize your tax bill. Now, granted, you're not really benefiting from that personally. Your kids aren't benefiting from it. Charity is benefiting from it. So basically what you're doing is you're shifting the wealth from the government to charity. Okay, so there's a lot that you can think about there. There's a lot of different structures. Two other things. One, provision that was put into place a couple of years ago was the opportunity zones. Basically investing in distressed areas, and I use that term loosely because it was based on old census data. So a lot of those distressed areas are not so distressed anymore. But basically, if you invest in one of these areas, your gains, you take that and put it in, you can defer this tax for another 5 years. And then after that, any gains above that, you can, you get a 10% discount on that gain that you deferred for 5 years. But then any gains above that after another 5 years are tax-free. So there's a lot of tax benefits you could do. Of course, you're tying up your money for 10 years, but be aware there's a lot of tax benefit you could have if you're willing to do that. And then the final one on a sale of a business that everyone should be aware of, and I will say it's happening more and more, are what's called the qualified small business stock election. It's for many C corporations. So we talked about S corporations. For C corporations only. If you're not in an excluded industry, and there's a list of those, but if you're not in one of those, if you got your stock when it was worth less than 50 million, and it's not fair market value, it's asset value. So when your business was worth less than 50 million, if you got your stock then and you hold the stock for 5 years before you sell, you can exclude the first 10 million in gain. It's actually 10 million or the greater of that, or your 10 times your basis, but essentially it's 10 million. So that's something to just be aware of, because not a lot of people are familiar with it. So be aware of that when you're taking a look at your business. You may be able to create multiple trusts. Again, this is a longer conversation, but you may be able to create multiple trusts to stack that exemption. So not just 10 million, but maybe you have 3 kids, so you get 40 million, 10 for yourself and 10 for each of your kids in a trust. So there's a lot of planning that can be done with C corporations. And that's all I'll say. I'll turn it over to Liz for her final thought.
Great final thought for you. My final thought is just the nice reminder sometimes that Congress, the members of Congress, the members of the Senate and their staff, they're not tax experts. There are people who work there who are, but these are people who are elected and they want to do something on education or immigration or criminal justice or any number of things, even infrastructure. And taxes probably aren't their favorite issue or something they spend a lot of time thinking about or anything else. So the fact that we're all focused on it doesn't necessarily mean that they're at the same point. That is really just why this takes so long. It's just because they have a lot of things they're working on. They will work on this, they will be focused on it in the fall, but it is taking a while for everybody to get up to speed and actually just start learning the complexities of the tax code. And that's just a lot of what it really is like behind the scenes in Washington. It's not a bunch of tax policy people running around Capitol Hill. They're just members trying to become experts on the issue of the day. And sometimes it's really hard stuff like the tax code.
Yeah, that's great. And so with that, I'd really like to say thanks to Liz and to Rich for helping out today on this call. Also to Jessica and Brett from the Institute for helping us put this together and coordinating the invite and the technology. Jeanette on our end, Teppenhart was great as well. So thanks to all the folks who participated on the call. We appreciate this. If we can be a resource of any way, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'll do that. And with that, I wish you a good rest of the day.